This video is sponsored by Squarespace. In this video, we're going to run through the 6 practical techniques that I use to remember without having to constantly refer back to notes. Pretty much everything I ever read. Hello again, you wonderful people. I'm Liam, a trainee lawyer living in London, and also a person who I reckon most of my friends, without sounding too arrogant, would probably consider to be someone who can hold a conversation in pretty much any topic and is generally well informed. But if you watch my last video, you will know that that is not because I read hundreds of books a year. It's because I read relatively few high quality books and articles. And crucially, I remember what I read. These 6 techniques fall into 2 buckets. The first of which I'm calling thinking slowly, which is inspired by Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. Crucially, kind of how can we get our brains when we're reading to reflect on what we're reading rather than constantly kind of seeking more and more information. And the second bucket is called applying spaced repetition. And I think of these 3 techniques as kind of ways that, although we're all familiar with this idea of spaced repetition in studying, well, how can we apply that to our lives on a day-to-day basis in everything that we read? So let's dive straight into thinking slowly. And the first technique is to take regular pauses when you're reading. And I mean really regular pauses. So whenever I'm reading, and often I'll actually just be listening to audiobooks out on my runs or out on a walk or on the train into work, I'll actually physically pause whatever it is that I'm listening to, generally an audiobook from Audible, and I will then actively reflect on what it is that I've just listened to. And I do this periodically, probably every 5, maximum 15 minutes. But if there's really kind of juicy section where I'm getting lots out of it, I'll probably pause maybe every couple of minutes to really reflect and try to work out what in that was essential. And you may be thinking that taking regular pauses is surely going to substantially decrease the amount you can read in a given time. While that's true, I think there are 2 important reasons I would kind of go against that. First of all, I'm not at all saying you shouldn't increase your reading speed. I think you should absolutely try to read the maximum number of words per minute that you can get in while retaining some of that information, at least for a couple of minutes. So I do use techniques like making sure my eyes aren't reading every single word, but instead skipping over the line the minimum number of times possible, or stuff like trying to prevent yourself reading aloud. These techniques are really helpful. What I'm instead saying is that there's limited benefit to reading, incredibly quickly for long periods of time, where therefore the stuff that you read at the start of that reading session has completely evaporated from your mind, and you're only left with what you read in maybe the last 5, even 2 minutes. So what should you actually try to do during these pauses? Well, for me, I think there are kind of 2 different types of non-fiction that I think about. The first is sort of stuff where I'm trying to get personal development or actionable items that I actually want to apply to my life out of what I'm reading. And the second is where I'm reading just to gain knowledge and information that I might use in the future to either, have an interesting conversation or in an exam or for some other purpose. When I'm then reading, what I'm thinking is, okay, for the actionable items, what can I take from what I'm reading that I could actually apply to my own life? What are the key action items? And for the stuff where I'm just kind of remembering content because it's interesting and I may use it at some point in the future, I'm thinking, right, what are the key pieces of information here? What are the key facts that I can hang this overall story as to what happened from? And I mention stories here really intentionally because actually humans are generally very good at remembering the content of stories. So when we read a fiction book or we read about history, we can remember kind of broadly what happened in the main events. Where we fall down though is either for action items that we're going to apply to our life, we actually just forget that those action items even exist, because although we might remember a story that we heard in the book of an example of some guy who did this thing, we actually don't remember that that idea even exists in our head. And then on the other side of that, when we're remembering kind of information in history, for example, we might remember the general story, but people are generally pretty awful at remembering kind of dates and specific places. So what can you practically do to actually remember that there are action items from a book you read that you want to take, or conversely, that there are key details that you want to remember in the overall story of whatever information you're trying to retain? Well, this is really a technique I developed while running, because when I was out on my runs, I couldn't remember everything that I would read in a whole chapter, maybe that I was listening to, by the end of my run. And so I would have to kind of limit myself to 3 key points, 3 action items, or 3 pieces of information that I could hang the rest of the story from by the end of my run. And I would then test myself whether I could remember all of those 3 pieces of information. And I would say there's a general rule of thumb, apply this to whenever you're reading. For a whole chapter or a whole segment of a book, have 3 key events, details, or 3 action items that you take away and kind of stick just to those and hang the rest of the story off those details. And when you're thinking about these 3 points that you're going to take away from a given segment of a book or an article, I also have been really trying myself, and I think you should, to focus on what are the practical steps I can take to apply to my own life that are going to improve my lived existence on a day-to-day basis. I think it's amazing that there is so much information out there that we can all learn and we can all kind of grow our understanding of different fields. But fundamentally, there is infinite stuff you could learn, and the internet means that all of that is at your fingertips. For me, the biggest kind of advantage of being able to access any book in the world ever written pretty much is that we can learn from those and actually apply the lessons from those books to our lives. So I'd encourage you to make these 3 things action items. And as a tangible example, I'm fascinated, the nerd that I am, by psychology. I love Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I've already mentioned it in this video once. And in that, for example, there's an experiment that shows that humans are kind of biased by the ending of an experience. So whatever their experience of, an hour, actually those last few minutes are what dictate their memory of that experience. It would have been easy for me to think, wow, that's a really interesting experiment, cool idea, and move on. But I actually kind of thought in my pause, right, what is the practical step I'm going to apply from this? Well, at the end of every single run at that point, I was doing this sprint finish. I was making myself hurt right at the end and essentially making myself hate running because my memory was of that horrendously painful sprint. Since then, I have no longer been sprinting at the end of my runs. I've now gone probably 8 or 9 months without virtually having a week not running, which I have never done in my life before. I have practically applied a principle, an idea from something that I read to my life, and it's made a huge difference. But it wasn't something that I was kind of given by Daniel Kahneman. It was an idea I applied to me by thinking about what I had read. So once you've worked out what those key takeaways are, I think there's a third technique that's really helpful to keep in mind in order to think slowly. And that is to question what the benefit is for you personally of that kind of actual item or information. Just because you've read something in a book doesn't mean it is a good idea or useful information for you personally. If you're never going to use that information, or the technique isn't in an area that you particularly struggle with, or it's not something that you've ever really considered or been that interested in, I think it's fine to just move on and accept that you're not going to remember that piece of information. So really what we're talking about here is remembering and actioning key pieces of information that are useful to you. Now let's move on to techniques 4 to 6, which fall within this second bucket I'm calling applying spaced repetition. Now, spaced repetition is a really kind of widely known term and technique in the study space. But I think it's relatively easy to kind of read content, articles, or books and not kind of think about trying to retain that information in the same kind of formalized way as you would when you're studying for a test. But just to very quickly go over what spaced repetition actually is, the Ebbinghaus curve of forgetting, this kind of famous graph, shows us that after just kind of one time reading a piece of material, we're likely to forget the vast majority of it within, say, a week. But with increasingly spaced out reviews of that material, we're likely to remember more and more for longer periods. So if we review it on day 1, we might then review it again day 2, day 5, day 12, day 25, day 100. And if we do that, we're likely to remember it for a very, very long time. So the first technique in this bucket is to simply write down whatever the key takeaways were that you took from a given chapter at the end of that chapter or article, if you're just reading an article. I personally have a note on my phone for every single book that I read, and I there jot down just in really brief bullet point form the very short takeaways that I have taken from each chapter. But I do strongly want to caveat this idea of writing everything down as a way of remembering it, because I don't think that's actually the case. I'm writing these notes down so that I can revisit them in dead time. I am not doing it so that that's kind of just my external memory bank that I will turn to, because I do think there is genuine value in having these things on your mind and keeping them in your mind. And I'm going to quote Plato here. Somewhat ironically, I'm going to have to read it from my laptop because I can't remember this quote. It is from Plato and it's about writing. And he says, "If men learn this, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance, no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. What you have discovered is a recipe not for memory, but for reminder." And that is really the point here. Writing is a key kind of tool that we can use to remind ourselves of key information, key points that we want to remember, but it is not itself memory. Next up is to just build repetitions of these key takeaways into your daily life. And I'm going to share 3 kind of ideas as to how you can do this. The first idea as to how you can build in 1 repetition is, at the end of your session reading, you can think, okay, what were my 3 key takeaways from this session overall? What were the 3 key takeaways from this chapter? I also, as I mentioned earlier, do that at the end of my runs. The second idea is to build in a repetition the next time you begin a reading session, or the next time you go out on a walk or a run or to work and you're listening to an audiobook. Think, okay, what were my takeaways from last time? And a third and final idea here, because I think it's really, really helpful for these actionable items that you really want to implement into your life, to have a trigger event for thinking about that. So to give a concrete example, when I was making a video about learned helplessness, which you should obviously watch, I did loads of reading around the topic and read tons of articles in this space. And now, whenever I feel myself, the trigger being, feeling myself, beating myself up because I struggle with something or I'm not very good at something the first time, I apply a technique that I took out of my reading of one of those articles, which is, to think about how my friend might respond to me if I were saying all of those negative thoughts about myself. It's a very kind of small technique that I took away from my reading, but I have a clear trigger and kind of a response that I can practically implement whenever that happens. And the 6th and final technique is to share your key takeaways with others. And, one of the most powerful things about having this channel is that whenever I'm reading a book or listening to an audiobook or reading an article, I'm thinking, okay, how can I practically take this away, apply it to my own life, and then share it with you guys and explain it to you in a way that really makes sense. So all of the best ideas that I come across, I'm thinking, okay, I could share that with others. And that process of having to take the idea, but make it my own, apply it to my own life and share it with you guys is hugely powerful. And you can absolutely do that without having a YouTube channel. You could have your own blog where you do that for yourself, or you could just talk to your friends about what you're reading. And if you have friends who think you're completely boring, find new friends. No, but hopefully some of your friends, if their interests somewhat align with yours, will find some of what you're reading interesting, and you'll be able to, just say, oh, I read this really interesting book the other day about money laundering. Let me tell you, friend who's sort of vaguely interested in that kind of thing, about the key takeaways I got from this book, and try to explain. They can challenge you, and it will massively improve both your own understanding and also your memory, because you are building in yet another highly memorable repetition of this information that's probably pretty spaced out from when you first read the information. Before we wrap up, I really quickly want to tell you about Squarespace, today's sponsor, and the awesomely powerful tool I use to make my own, I think, stunning website. And I've got to say, I was so pleasantly surprised when I first started using Squarespace, just how easy it was to make a beautiful mobile responsive site using their templates. It has tons of features, from email campaigns to e-commerce, so you can, like me, sell your PDF notes, embroidered cushions, houseplants, or, well, just about anything. They have a very intuitive blog interface if you just want to get started writing and publishing your own content, and their website analytics are amazingly easy to use and learn from. So yeah, go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Liam Porritt to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks so much for watching. Please do drop me a like and a comment to let me know what you thought. I will always try to reply. And then make sure you write down your key takeaways from this video itself and keep those in mind over the next couple of weeks. And finally, then go and watch my video where I describe how reading less actually made me a whole lot smarter, I think, or at least I hope. Speak again very, very soon.